really big music. And I don't mean big as in lot.
And when he and his wife died, son was the only one living there.
Right.
Just,
Welcome to the Wednesday, March 26, 2014 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. First item of business is approval of the minutes from March 12.
I'll move to approve.
Thank you. Motion, is there a second? All right, Kurt. Any corrections or other alterations, improvements that you see in those?
Like typo?
Like typos?
I had a couple down. Just one sentence, I think, in there. It said R instead of area. I'm trying to find it now. Where did it go?
Is that from the one?
Previous?
Yes, that was in the previous one.
Well, there was one in this one,
Oh, we
too.
copied it over and pasted it in
Why
again.
can't I find it? Did I get rid of the... Oh, well. It was, oh, in number 2, the first sentence, Commission believes the current mode of business, blah, blah, blah. I think that's area, should be area, is likely.
Sorry, number 2.
Number 2, the very first word in the second line.
On which page?
Page 2.
Page 2 of 3. We're in a different document.
Are we?
You got March 12th.
Is that the March
Do
12
I?
document?
Sorry.
Correspondence online.
Front page, the title, the date just underneath the title.
What did I do here? Okay. You're right. Never mind.
All right, that's from last time.
That's the same one.
Thank you for the clarification. So with that, I'll call for a vote. All in favor of approving the minutes for the 12th? Say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Nels and Kurt. Thank you. All right. We're on to correspondence. Anything from staff?
Anything from staff?
Okay. This is the spot in our agenda, the second meeting of the month, to speak up about the readings that we have online, the optional readings, if you have an interest in sharing any thoughts on any of those. All right. I will recommend to you reading the ADUs and Don'ts article, which is there. That is an analysis of ADU zoning codes and their relative success or lack of success in actually creating ADUs. And he addresses a number of the issues that we are wrestling with in terms of parking, owner occupancy. His checklist is a little bit longer than the ones that we have, but at any rate, commend that resource to you. There were 2 on downtown-related things that I thought were interesting, and one, Gina Terusio, if you're listening, it was the 12 strategies to improve downtown. It included the idea of consolidate regional economic development organizations into one physical location. And Gina was at the State of the City address today. Gina was talking about the idea of doing some work to improve the Moscow Chamber offices. And so I don't know if in that whole thinking, there seems at times to have been unused space towards the back, or they rented it out to other entities. Maybe the right other entities would make more sense than some other entity. At any rate, we'll do this reading process again for next month, and I have arranged for you with the courtesy of the Moscow Pullman Daily News, 4 articles on surface water reservoir issues. They date back about 15 years. They kindly went and dug through some of the old articles and are willing to have them on the free side of the paywall. They gave me the text, and so I'll find a web hosting to mount it on. And we'll have those available, and I'll put those into you as one of the candidates. And welcome other thoughts that you have for things that you'd like us to read collectively. On another note, I visited with the Sustainable Environment Commission at their last meeting, which was following our meeting. And because the whole conversation about water in Moscow and the sustainability of water in Moscow, many of the things that might be involved are not really land use planning questions at all, but they're low flush toilets or changing rate structures or things like that. So I visited with the Sustainable Environment Commission and asked if they were interested in exploring and proposing water conservation strategies from the vantage point of their commission's mission. And they indicated that they were interested in talking about that further, so I hope to hear some updates from them. All right. Anything else in correspondence from anyone? All right. Transportation Commission, Joel?
The Transportation Commission met on the 13th, 2 weeks ago. It was a short meeting. One of the items was a report by Tom Lamar. He recently attended a National Bike Summit in Washington, D.C. He saw some things that apparently impressed him very much. Hopefully some of them can be brought here. We continued with our discussion of bikes on sidewalks. The Commission is going to be approaching the Administrative Committee for our proposal to have a zone in downtown where people are encouraged, although not required by ordinance, to walk bicycles on sidewalks. And also there will be encouraged, if capable, of riding in the traffic, and proposal to use Sharrow's insignia on the pavement to convey that. So it's the main topics that came from the meeting on the 13th. The next meeting of the Commission is April 9th, and I have not seen an agenda for that.
Okay. Joel, you might be interested in considering whether 2 of our readings from this month would interest the Transportation Commission.
Okay. I'll look.
One is regarding a downward trend in driving, a national trend that's been going on since the onset of the recession. The question being, will it continue? And the other is related to parking and parking requirements, which also connects, I think, to our, I want to say shotgun, but that's not the right word. Tandem parking issue. All right. Questions for Joel? Open microphone. This is a time when the public has a chance to come down here and speak with the Commission regarding matters that are not on the agenda or currently pending before the Planning and Zoning Commission. And so again, I encourage members of our listening audience that they could avail themselves of this opportunity. Number 6, review of the proposed funeral home mortuary code amendment. Bill?
So you may recall this is a continuation of an inquiry that we received from the owner and operator of Short's Funeral Chapel that is located in the Neighborhood Business Zoning District that was issued a conditional use permit or a special use permit back in 1981 but it was kind of unclear under what authority that was issued, and currently they're not listed as a permitted use in that zoning district. So the owner had asked the commission to consider whether they would like to propose an amendment to the council to include that as a listed permitted use in that district. And we had kind of a conversation about other similar types of uses like churches and others that are permitted in the neighborhood business district, and that it seemed like it was a good fit. So the commission directed staff to go back and take a look at an amendment that would modify the listed use to include that within the neighborhood business district. And I indicated that we also wanted to take a look at some of the other zoning districts just to look at other commercial districts where it may be appropriate. The only two districts currently that that use is named in is in the central business and the general business district, and it's a conditionally permitted use in those two districts. It's not named in the motor business, and it's not included in the neighborhood business, as we already covered. So we prepared a draft. It's a very short ordinance with two very small changes. So we have a draft ordinance here for your consideration that the first page under Section 3.7 would insert the term mortuaries underneath the permitted principal uses and structures, along with the churches, synagogues, mosques, governmental offices, libraries, parks, museums, art galleries. We would insert the term mortuaries, along with police and fire stations and similar public or private institutions. And it seemed to be kind of fit, rather than putting it as its own use, it seemed to kind of fit with those other similar types of uses in the district. So that's where we chose to suggest inserting it. And then in the neighborhood business district, we did add that as a separate identified use, item number 9 on section 2 of the ordinance on page 2 of 3. It's a fairly simple code amendment just to include that as a named use in those districts. And so I just wanted to get input and feedback from the commission and whether the commission would like us to go ahead and proceed to notice this for hearing.
Bill, you said that it's conditional in general business.
And central business.
And central business. And this proposal would make it by right in motor business and neighborhood business.
In the central business, I mean, just to give a little bit of the thought process, the CB district is an area where there's no off-street parking required. So establishing a use that has this very peaking, high parking demand downtown would I think it was there because that was where the use was previously. So prior to 1981, Shorts was downtown. They moved out of the downtown area in 81. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be areas on the periphery of the central business district where that use could be appropriate, but a careful evaluation of the impact upon parking and available parking to serve the use should be considered as part of that, since no parking is required by right in that district. Mm-hmm. And so that was the intent of keeping that as a conditionally permitted use in the CB, is just to consider the impacts upon parking in the downtown core. The GB does have off-street parking requirements. It's generally located on the periphery of the downtown core. Where GB exists today predominantly is in the south end of downtown in the Gritman area. Again, it has that potential because GB is intended to be around the periphery of the downtown core, but where it's distant from public parking facilities to where on-site parking is necessary. There is a possibility we could shift that from a conditionally to a principal permitted use in that district. But we felt, a CU, because of its proximity to the downtown core, might be appropriate as well, just to make sure that we can carefully evaluate the parking impacts. I don't know that I anticipate that we're going to have an interest in one in the GB district. The motor business, you're now out into, higher highway corridors for the most part. Off-street parking is required, and you are getting distant generally from the downtown core. And that seemed to be a district that it certainly could fit within. So that was the general thought process. The GB, we did debate back and forth about whether we should shift its current status from a conditional to a principal permitted. We just decided to leave it in the conditionally permitted. That was just staff's recommendation, but certainly if the commission would like to do something differently, we can.
What strikes me is it seems a little lopsided to be conditional in general business and by right in neighborhood business. I'm fully on board with motor business because it's the big parking lot or whatever is not going to be intrusive in that environment or traffic surge or anything. But it seems like we're favoring driving it towards a neighborhood business, which is where it happens to be located today.
And part of the consideration in the neighborhood business district is that the other uses that we felt were similar, such as churches and other facilities that would tend to have large parking facilities, are a use by right today in those districts. In the GB, I think they also, they're by right in the GB district as well. So, it is certainly possible that if we wanted to look at shifting, there is the very similar, actually probably the exact same language of the churches, synagogues, mosques, terminal offices, libraries, museums, so forth. That same language does exist in the GB district, and it could be inserted within that section, item number 7, if you wished, as a permitted principal use.
So you're hearing my question, and you're moving by saying by right in both, rather than conditional in both.
Yeah, that's the general thought, because if you look at the similar types of uses that have similar impacts and operating characteristics, that those are the ones that I would say that it probably fits within. In the GB, the ones that we do have as conditionally permitted uses include, drive-up windows, automobile sales, residential uses, takeout establishments, gasoline service stations, group daycare facilities, large daycare facilities in schools and commercial schools. And so those are you're getting into some of the, it's very similar to how the downtown is treated, with the exception of the residential uses, where residential uses above and behind the commercial use are allowed by right in the CB district. But you're getting to uses that are more motor vehicle based, so the drive-up windows, the gas stations, the auto sales. The GB is anticipated to have kind of a similar downtown character to the central business. It's just that you have to have your own parking facilities because you're getting so distant from those public parking facilities that you can't rely upon them to serve the use. And so the uses that tend to be conditionally permitted in the GB are very similar to the uses that tend to be conditionally permitted in the central business district. So I'm assuming that's probably how that generally occurred.
The more motor business.
Right. Now, the mortuaries are probably more similar to the churches, synagogues, mosques, and aren't that maybe motor business. It may be a high parking demand, but so is a church. And so, it is something that certainly we could just mimic the language in the motor business district for that same list of uses and similar institutions, and insert mortuaries there. I don't think that there would be any harm in that. I think the parking would be mitigated because there is then parking required in the GB district, and it would be grouped along with the similar uses as in the NB.
How much parking is required for a general business?
Well, it's the same table, so it just depends upon the use.
Okay.
So a mortuary is one parking stall per 75 square feet used for assembly. So it'd be kind of the chapel area of the funeral home that we would look at the square footage, and it would be one stall for every 75 square feet.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be hard to get up to 15, 20 stalls, it seems like.
It certainly depends on the size or scale of the facility, but you can get to fairly high counts pretty easily, assuming you're going to want probably a couple thousand square feet for that type of area.
How does that compare to the requirement for churches?
Churches are generally required based upon fixed seating, so it's one parking stall per 3 seats or 60 inches of pew, or one for every 40 square feet for assembly. So it's on the assembly comparison, it's slightly less. Churches tend to be more of a fixed seating. It's interesting why mortuaries wouldn't be based on fixed seating as well, because they tend to have a very similar facility. We will need to go in and modernize and update these. We actually have a draft of a new parking table for the updates on the code, because some of these standards aren't good ones. Ones that are based on employees, that change over time and other things. But those are the current standards.
Shorts would currently meet those standards easily, I would think.
Easily, yeah. I don't think you'd have any problem.
Wouldn't be anything non-conforming with their parking lot.
No, and if it was, it still would be improving their condition, because the parking standard really doesn't change regardless of what district you're in, with the exception of the CV, where you were just essentially exempted from this table. And so if they are short in parking today, They currently would be non-conforming from that perspective. The more significant non-conformance is just the use itself. But I mean, I can sort of see the GB moving that to in the same fashion as we do the motor business district.
Yeah, it seems like if the parking is the big issue for it, and if it's already required, I would be fine with it being by right in there.
So by right in GB, CU still for central business. By right, what we're adding in neighborhood and motor business.
I mean, we even contemplated whether it should be a CB use, right? The central business intended to be an entertainment and retail district.
I've been to some pretty entertaining funerals.
But we can just leave it as a CU. I don't think, just based upon the nature of the use, that somebody's going to try to locate a mortuary downtown, just because of the competition for parking and the timing of services. I just think the likelihood it's not going to happen, so it's probably not going to be harmed. But we contemplate it should even be there. It's an odd location for the use.
So my sense is that we would like staff to bring this forward, do the notification, et cetera, bring this forward for public hearing. And that we would make it a by right use in general business is our other request for them to consider.
So we would have a new section in the ordinance. It would read very much like the motor business. It's even the same item number 7. It would read identically just before the GB, amending the GB district.
Okay.
And then we'd be striking it from this conditionally permitted use list. And I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Yes.
Probably do the second meeting in April, just to get our 15-day statutory notice requirement. So it'll be the second meeting in April that we'd have the hearing.
Good. Great. Thank you. Next is the University Zoning District.
This is just kind of an introduction to the topic tonight. We don't have a formal proposal to really propose, I guess, this evening. It is something that's a bit of an oddity in the zoning code. And so what I'm handing out is just a copy of our special zoning districts. And the city has 2 special zoning districts, the first of which is the University District, and the second is the Legacy Crossing Overlay Zone District. The University District is kind of an interesting creation. Prior to the adoption of the University Zone in 1981, the university was essentially zoned multifamily residential, the entire campus. And you need to also understand for some of the background is that the university itself is not subject to the city's zoning regulations. We don't do construction permitting. The university doesn't have to follow our parking standards or setbacks because there are certain state institutions that have exemptions within the Constitution where local regulation would impede upon their constitutionally defined purpose of the entity. So right now, the university itself is not subject to any zoning standards of the city, but we have a lot of private in-holdings that are actually kind of in the university core. And it kind of makes a bit of an interesting dynamic when uses are happening, comparable or similar uses are happening on property that is either owned by the university or one that is privately held. And it happens in the Greek system predominantly, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But the university district itself was really, it appears to be it was a district that was created to paint university property to say this is owned university, it's university owned, and there are really no zoning standards for this property. The intent statement of the district is kind of interesting. It talks about the intent is to create a university district to enhance the university environment. But then it kind of goes on to also, so it talks a little bit about the intent that the land in the university zoning district must be owned by the University of Idaho, which is kind of an interesting, this is the only district we have that has a requirement that some entity owns it before it can hold the zoning designation. And also if a property is sold by that entity, that would then trigger a zoning designation change of that property because now it's being transferred out of the university's hands. It goes on kind of midway through the intent statement. They also provided in this chapter is a provision for notice to the city for those new and expanded uses in the zoning district where there's a major impact on water resources, the air quality, the visual environment, public utilities, uses and parking in and surrounding the university zoning district. And the intent of the notice is to provide sufficient time for the city to identify potential problems resulting from the new use or expanded use and to be able to work to alleviate these problems. And so it's really clear kind of talking about the fact that there are no standards, so there's this courtesy notice so we can work through issues collectively together. And then as you get into permitted uses, there are a list of uses that you would generally see associated on the university campus. So it's schools and commercial schools and educational institutions, dormitories, fraternities, bookstores, student union buildings, commercial activities, but commercial activities that are directly related to the university itself. So it's kind of an interesting, so commercial activities shall be prohibited from locating in the zoning district except those directly related to the university, their technology transfer mission, or the operation of the student union building. And then we've got obviously college and university administrative office, teaching facilities, warehouses, maintenance facilities, and RV parks. Interesting in that use. So it's kind of an interesting list of uses. Section C goes into the notification of the new or expanded uses. So that goes through the process about how the university will notify the city. And then as you get into the bulk and dimensional standards where we typically have lot areas and lot widths and setbacks, there are none specified. There is only a rear setback where a property is abutting a residentially zoned district of 20 feet, but we couldn't enforce that, quite honestly, because if it was a university project or facility, they aren't really subject to our zoning standards anyhow. Use after sale, university land sold or leased for non-university uses must be rezoned before a new use can be established. And so again, that is that kind of trigger based upon ownership of having to go to a different designation. And then in the RV park section, it talks about how the applicant must demonstrate to the Planning and Zoning Commission that the RV park will not generate traffic volumes that would be a nuisance to the neighborhood in which it's located, and then it refers to the sign code. So it's kind of an interesting section of the zoning code, and when it's creating a district to clearly identify university properties that aren't subject to standards, has some kind of pseudo standards or a notification process, but they're not really standards per se. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic. We also have properties, a few that are owned by the university that are zoned R4 that just never have been transferred over to the university district, and even in those situations, if it's a university use or activity, then they don't need to comply with the zoning code standards. It's a bit of a unique district. So if we looked at the campus, this here. So everything, I believe, it should be fairly accurate, although as you can see, the one that was probably left off maybe hasn't been changed yet. The U of I did acquire the rail corridor here. And there are about 8 different entity names in the tax assessor's database of how they track Regents properties, and the assessors are not very concerned about it because there is no tax revenues to be collected off the properties, and so you can tend to get Regents or fragments of Regents or University of Idaho's, so you have to search the database by about 8 or 9 different names to try to make sure you're capturing the properties. But the properties shown in yellow are the university's land holdings. And so obviously the main campus core on the west and the golf course arboretum is all university held. And then down along Sweet Avenue, and then the married student housing and the child care facility over on here to Taylor, essentially from Sweet to Taylor is pretty much exclusively university owned. You have the parking lot on the Sweet Avenue site, and then some recent acquisitions by the university on the east side of Paradise Creek that are now owned by the university. And you also have some similar railroad corridor properties, with the exception of the one Union Pacific parcel here that is all university held. And then you have these private inn holdings in the middle of kind of the core campus, and this is really predominantly the old Greek section of the campus. And then there are a couple other triangular-shaped parking lots located up here that the university holds as well. So those are the holdings, and the challenge we tend to run into is down in this area, because we will have situations where we'll have a fraternity or sorority being developed on on a privately held parcel that has setback standards, that zone, and this we'll see in a zoning map, this largely is zoned R4 with some of the university properties zoned university. So that if the property is privately held and there's a fraternity sorority developing a house on that property, they have off-street parking standards, they have setbacks, they have building height limitations, they have all the R4 zoning district limitations. And then we'll have another one being developed across the street that's on university-owned property that has none of those standards. So you kind of have a bit of an inequity between activities that are happening on the campus core. And so that's kind of one of the aspects of looking at this as a more uniform district, is trying to understand what the relationship should be. The other aspect that we run into on the campus is the university campus is a lot like the central business district in that there is a actively managed parking system, obviously much more actively managed than even ours. Ours is a fairly small system compared to what exists on campus. And so as you look at potential opportunities for new Greek houses in the old Greek core, our off-street parking requirement for a sorority or a fraternity was one space for every 2 occupants. So if you had 50 or 60 people in the house, you're talking 25 to 30 parking spaces, and trying to create these large private parking lots in an old Greek core is impossible to do. It's just not achievable, and most all the houses that are developed there don't have off-street parking other than a handful, half a dozen spaces typically off the alley behind. That's usually the house mom or the cook or, for the house. And so you have very limited on-site parking, and they rely upon the purple permit system. All the on-street parking in this core is generally in the Greek core is managed under a purple permit system, which means you have to be a resident of the Greeks to be able to get a permit to park there. And then they have Greek designated purple parking lots on the outlying areas of the Greek core to serve those uses as well. So it's an area that I think mimics the central business district in a lot of ways with respect to the managed parking system, and also probably from the policy of trying to help maximize the residential opportunities on the campus. That helps, on-campus living helps student retention and success, and that's a good thing. And trying to not degrade the character of that corridor by requiring large surface parking lots as projects. And we have had this, like the SE House is one good example that did an addition about 8 years ago and built another parking lot next to it between it and the LDS Center that's just located just to the north of it, because it's on a privately held property. And so there's that's maybe not necessarily the best thing we want to do. Maybe we want to have that parking be managed in that managed parking system and be able to maximize the opportunity for living, and also try to promote the idea of students coming to campus without bringing cars to the community. So being able to maximize that opportunity. So those are a couple different items that we have been thinking through a little bit. So looking here a little bit closer into the area. So those are the university holdings, and you can see we have quite a few private in-holdings that are captured within the campus core. And we did take a look at some other communities to try to see other examples of zoning districts that are related to the campus environments, and we had very few that had this much private land intrusion into the university campus. I mean, they're almost exclusively, there's a bold line where the campus begins, and it's all campus interior. And we couldn't really find a good example where we had this much private in holdings kind of in what we'd consider the campus. Even WSU College Hill is kind of on the other side, and so you just don't have quite as much in the core. And again, for us, it's really a lot of the Greek system that we're looking at here. That is probably the predominant land use on the private holdings, and so it's a challenge.
Yeah, and then just to make sure I understand, the city will never have zoning authority over the university properties.
Correct.
Okay.
So long as, and we're having a discussion about this, trying to understand the boundaries of that, because there are properties the university also holds, for example, the Police and Fire Mall and the University Inn, that we do manage the zoning, because it's really not a core university purpose or function for that commercial activity. It's a ground lease as a commercial enterprise. And so in that instance, it's not in the core and mission of their constitutional purpose. And so, that we do manage. But when it's into the core and it's directly related to their core mission and purpose, then, that's where we are trying to understand. If it's a university building or a facility, we don't even permit it. It's permitted through the Division of Building Safety through Boise, And DVS, there's an inspector on campus that does that inspection service and does the plan review and so forth. But if there is the SAE house or some other, privately held fraternity sorority, or any fraternity sorority typically owns the house and is ground leasing from the university, we will permit those. But if one happens to be on property they're being leased from the university, we're not applying zoning standards, but we're still doing the building permits and the building inspection services on it. We're just not applying zoning standards to that. And it just creates a little bit of an interesting...
Yeah, this would never get confusing, would it?
It would never. It's going to get more confusing. As you then look into the area, this is actually the zoning. The area is largely zoned, so the yellow shade here is R4. The green is university zoned. And we have one little pocket of neighborhood business called the Perch. Everybody's familiar with that? The areas here outlined in purple are areas that are properties that are privately owned and zoned university, which shouldn't occur. Underneath the zoning code, you're supposed to be owned by the university before you can be zoned university. So St. Augie's is zoned university. Somebody who knows the Greek system better, the house with the slip and slide hill.
Yeah.
Everyone knows the slip and slide hill, right? So we have these that are highlighted in purple. So the SAE house, like I mentioned, is actually zoned university, but it's privately held. So when they did the project, there's no exception from the off-street parking standard in the U district we looked at. And so, the parking standards applied, even though it was zoned U, they wouldn't have had setbacks or building heights because they're zoned U, but they're privately. So we have some missing here. And then we also have some...
Again, I'm lost on SAE owns their own land.
Owns their own land, but is zoned university.
But it's owned university because they chose or because
I
why?
have no idea. I wish I could explain why. Because somebody probably thought it was owned by the university when the zone change and a description was created when the U district was implemented in 81. I'm going to guess. We also had this kind of oddity in the middle of the U district of the RTO zone on Sweet Avenue and part of Railroad and a little bit of College, which is this yellow. And I haven't researched that as well. This was before Alturas was established out on the east side of town in 95 and 96. The business, what was going to be the tech park was going to be closer to campus, and I actually think it was on the Lot 60 property was the intent, because it was across near the incubator. It was going to be kind of that natural, and I don't know, Nels, you might know more about some of the history of that, but...
I don't. Obviously, this is a very hairy issue that, and the sensibility of it changed as the university lost power, you might say. 30, 40 years ago, it just seemed like the university was definitely in control of every space, but the state has not been entirely happy with that, and so now the state oversees these zoning things. I was just trying to ask a question. In this case, why didn't you go across the creek across from the parking lot?
So this is all UMC now.
Right. So this is talking about zoning, not ownership. The colors are zoning. The outlines are kind of mismatches of ownership compared to what the university zone would tend to dictate. So it doesn't necessarily, just because the university owns it, doesn't mean it has to be zoned university, but the university owning it is a precondition if they want it to be zoned university. And so, and honestly, from the university's perspective, you can call us what you want. You can't regulate us, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, that's the general sense, is that they have an immunity from the zoning code, and so, their opinion was, sure, zone us UMC. We don't care. You can't tell us what to do anyways. So and they supported the concept and the vision about what we're trying to achieve there. So I don't want to say that it was not without their support, but it is somewhat irrelevant to them if it's something that they're going to do for their core function. they can do it without having to comply with the regulations. And so to them, it's not a critical piece what we call them or what color we make them on the map, because they have their status of their constitutional exemption. We also have then these blue that are university-owned and not zoned university. So there's like the Elmwood Apartments. There's the two little houses on 6th Street that they acquired in toward a while ago. There's this parking lot in the corner of University or Deacon and can't recall this University of Idaho there. But there are a handful of parcels now that they do own that are still retained the old zoning designation. And again, the university, if they acquire it, they're really not going to make an application to rezone it because it doesn't apply to them anyway, so they don't really care a great deal. So over time, I don't know if these things, some of these I know are related to transactions that have occurred over time. I know the Elmwoods was an acquisition maybe 15 years ago. The houses more recently. The parking near the railroad, I couldn't really tell you, railroad apartments, when that was acquired. But there have been things that have happened over time that probably have let the map get kind of off track from what the zoning code was kind of trying to direct. And I don't know, it makes a great deal of sense to have a zoning district that requires you to change it every time ownership on the property changes either. And so, the general sense, I think I've got a couple more here. This you're not going to be able to read. This really is an inventory. So I had Mike work on this last year a little bit because it's something that we've been looking at as we are looking at updating the zoning code to look at how should we treat the university campus. And so these are hard to read, but generally it's a description of the use. It's a multifamily dwelling, and it's a 2-story structure, multifamily, and 3-story. Just trying to get a sense of the uses that we have in this core. What are the scale of the buildings? We can look at what the setbacks kind of are from the aerial photography. But we think what's there now probably isn't the most logical way to manage and treat this. This is an ongoing conversation with the university, and so that's why I said we don't have a proposal before you, but it is something that we're researching, and it is something that's a little bit convoluted or complex. I did want to kind of just do an introduction on the topic. And I would generally prefer to see, since it really doesn't matter what we call the university, I don't know that we need a district just specifically for them. I would like to have a U district that just applies to the entire area and addresses, essentially all the uses that you generally have in the campus. For the most part, most everything that's listed here is really what's happening here, with the exception of, a lot of these are somewhat tied to the university. So when we're talking about dormitories, fraternities, sororities, houses, apartments and other residences that are owned by the university, we just strike the owned by the university portion of it. Or some limited scale commercial uses like we have in the Perch and some other activities, some other types of uses. We would work on developing a university district that would not be so exclusive to be applied to just university held properties, but apply to this entire area and capture the uses that are occurring in that area because they're there already, and they're not changing, and it's not like we're allowing new things in. And then probably model after, this is the conversation, probably, looking at whether we model this after the CB district and not have off-street parking requirements and rely upon the managed parking system to meet that demand. And as far as bulk and dimensional standards for setbacks and building heights, we would mimic or model what's really probably there. The university, if they wanted to do a large dormitory tower, wouldn't be subject to it anyhow, and so they could do whatever they wanted. But we would, have some general parameters that may be similar to the R4 as far as building height, probably lesser setbacks, because this area tends to be a little bit more of it's somewhat urban, somewhat because of the scale and proximity of buildings to the street. But we would craft something that kind of fits what's there today, have a university district that breaks at the creek predominantly to the west, and get away from this patchwork and having to track ownership, and then having one thing having across the street held to a certain standard and parking requirements, and another one across the street not having to have that standard. And so that's the general sense. I wanted to just kind of introduce it because it is a bit convoluted, and have a little bit of discussion and see what the commission's thoughts were.
after all these years, I've never looked at this in quite this way. I've been, when I was at the university in facilities, I think that I took that haughty view of being over all things, so who cared? We didn't have to listen, but I'm not stunned by looking at it. It's more lifelike than many zoning. It might be more European in a way than it is American, in the sense that we think we want to control things, but we can't. And so we make some zones and act like we know what we're doing. But this is a really cool area, the way it fits. And I think it has all to do with history. I think it has to do with the fact that the university was always going back away from town, and the Greek system was doing its thing while no one was paying attention. I mean, it was just happening. And then we got this very intriguing story where we get these other things to meet. I guess one of the things that I heard you say that I'm not sure of how to feel about is, as we're looking at Legacy Crossing and as we're trying to cross the creek more, I'm not sure that we wouldn't want to try and see Legacy Crossing and this strange area in the university as more of a whole than to use the creek as a boundary again. That's just something that I've discovered, in the last few months, about why do we have to use that creek as a boundary of something. And as we get more bridges across it and learn how to walk and jump across the creek, I think it might change our view of it a little bit. So I was a little worried about you saying, well, we'll use the creek as a divider line, because I would like to wipe that away a little bit.
So Nels, I hear you saying, look at the region from Jackson to Ash, or somewhere on the left of the yellow, basically, and take that whole, so the gray plus the little snippet of green plus the yellow, and begin to think of that as one new hybrid space.
Well, I'm beginning to think of that, and I hope soon we'll be able to share this workbook. I'm working on a Legacy Crossing workbook. Mm-hmm. And the big thing, I'm deviating now just a little bit from where Bill is, but I hope to share it with you all soon. And part of the major discovery that we made in the last 6 months is that we should not think of the creek as a dividing line, but we should see the whole Legacy Crossing and the parking lot and the university all being amalgamated into a holistic pattern, and you'll see that a little bit in this workbook when we get it done. But you're aware of all that since you worked with the students. I had a class last semester, and Nels and Bill spent quite a bit of time with my students as well as we worked on crossing the Paradise Creek.
And you had the students work on what is essentially 2 super blocks. This one.
Yes.
And this one here.
And that one. And it was hard to decide where that super block should end. Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, as often the case, as a professor, you can't quite tell your students what to do, and they teach you something when they get a field. So we ended up working all the way down to College Avenue and thinking about that property, even though some of it was private and some of it was university. We thought about that triangle with the bookstore and the up to College as one piece that could be used for this entire development.
I'm sorry, what does UMC stand for?
Urban Mixed Commercial.
Well, anyway, I didn't want to go away from where you were necessarily, but I think there will be at least some more questions will come into people's mind as they see some of the student project ideas that could happen in some of this land in future. As this, I mean, we were told 100 years ago by Olmsted to engage with the city. The university was told by Olmsted that that would be a real positive thing to do. We immediately ignored Olmsted and bought cheap land to the west as much as we could, but knowing that we'd run into the Washington state line at some point. And now we're doing 100 years later what Olmsted sort of predicted we ought to do, and many of you remember that triangular piece here that's a parking lot was whatever Palouse Producers or whatever. What was the name of it, John? I had all the chemical.
Well, you had all the chemical people down there, and you also had 3 or 4 petroleum jobbers. So
it was a bad site, and it had to be cleansed, and it was sitting there for years being reclaimed, and now it's usable.
Joe?
I'm trying to figure out what the university's perspective would be on the regulation of private property within. Taking parking as a focus. It's a question, I guess, of whether the university is happy to have private land developed as a multifamily use and accommodating the vehicles with purple lots, which are not costless to the university. And I'm also trying to think of worst case.
Yes.
What happens if some private developer decides to put up a 15-story multifamily apartment building in there? Do they have to have parking provisions? So I guess my question is, what's the university's perspective on the degree of regulation they'd like to see with the inholdings?
That dialogue is ongoing, so we haven't reached, which is why I don't have a proposal yet. but that conversation is ongoing, and that is something we've talked about, that the university would be, in one sense, potentially committing to meet that need. We anticipate that we would have height limits that would prohibit the 15-story worst-case scenario. So right now in that area, it's the 40-foot height limitation of the R4 district. Now the university would be immune from that if they were doing a project. So we would propose, but a private entity would not. And so I think we would have controls still in place to ensure that it doesn't create something of that magnitude or nature. But it's an ongoing conversation regarding the impact upon the existing parking system. I think generally it's viewed as there is excess capacity in the system that the university can accommodate. Maybe not in the most convenient location for everybody, but that there is capacity in the system. And it is something that we generally want to promote, the idea of a lesser parking standard for housing that will most likely be for faculty, students, or staff on this close proximity to campus. It's a good location to have that type of housing with a reduced parking requirement. And so but that is the conversation we're having with the university right now, where we are working through that process.
Do you think, when do you imagine first parking structure is going to be?
That I couldn't tell you.
Our lifetime?
Well, you know, other universities, of course, are building them, and I asked that question bluntly to Dr. Hoover when he was president, and he just bluntly told me not in my watch, and so I let it go. But in order for this to develop in a more holistic way, there'll have to be other ways to park our vehicles than on grade. There's no doubt about it. And so one just doesn't know when that first is Washington State, with their little pile of money, has been able to do quite a few structures, but we haven't. And Boise State can do it, but we can't seem to do it yet.
I still had to walk a mile afternoon meeting over at Pullman between the parking lot and my meeting space.
Well, even with all their parking structures, it's a mayhem over there on a basketball night. You can be lost out in the on a golf course someplace 3 miles from where you want to be.
So what could evolve, I'm hearing you say, Bill, is that a managed parking strategy managed by the city, and now somewhat by St. Andrews, New St. Andrews, on one side, central business district area, and maybe it would expand somewhat beyond that. And then on the other side, a managed parking managed by the university, which they would decide to agree they're going to take on the private in-holdings and roll them into the parking solution. And actually, I think that the more those two big players evolve, the more likely you'll get to structured parking, because you'll have large entities which will have large amounts of parking fees to think about working with, and see large amounts of parking need that they need to meet. And so I think that's a very interesting outcome, is that there would start to be these two big parking zones that were each managed actively by different players.
How do the areas that are subject to the university parking permit system get defined? I mean,
Well, right now, the break is at the creek. So on the west side of the creek, even on the public streets, the city has entered into an agreement that the university manages that parking.
okay, so it's the city and the university just make a deal on it.
Correct. So, there are public streets, and this is really the largest extent of public streets on campus. When you start to get to Nez Perce and Perimeter, those are not public streets. They're not platted right-of-ways, so they're not the city's territory. They are essentially private streets that are maintained by the university, so they manage that already.
Yeah.
We have an agreement for both maintenance of the roadways here, because if the university wishes to have a higher level or higher standard of maintenance, they have that ability. They do snow removal in a lot of the areas in here, and they manage the parking on the public streets in this core. And they really have already committed to meeting. A lot of the Greek system and houses are private entities, and the university is already taken on providing parking for them as part of that system. There are a couple apartment complexes in here. Actually, one is half owned by the foundation, and probably the largest one is the one on Deacon, and then you've got Charlie's on Railroad. So that there are a handful of apartment complexes that are already developed, and the area is largely built out. It's probably at that 80% mark to some degree, but there are one sorority, one fraternity in the pipeline coming forward. So, there are going to be a few sites that this will densify in the old Greek core, but I don't imagine dramatic shifts unless the university really has, the trajectory of enrollment and everything changes dramatically.
But I was kind of thinking that might be a sort of a convenient defining characteristic for this zone is the area where the university is managing the parking.
Yeah, and I guess, and there is somewhat of a, not that I think we should be stuck on the boundary of the creek, because I think there are some really good possibilities if we can help bridge that gap. There is a sensitivity of university moving eastward into the core with university facilities that are tax exempt and kind of coming into the downtown core. And so there is a sensitivity about that a little bit with the city. But, that doesn't mean that the project informs and everything can't coexist, or some pieces become private on campus and some campus comes public, or because there are certain elements like the bookstore or others that might be good fits out into that area. So we've got to work through that. But that is something I know the URA is concerned about, trying to foster private development that generates tax base and increment for them to assist with development of the core. So,
are you doing this primarily to bring some clarity to the issue, to the area, or what's I couldn't quite be sure what made you decide to start dealing with this?
Because we are going to be restructuring all the zoning districts, and this is one that's a bit of an animal based on this ownership configuration and what exists there. That's going to take a little bit more time, plus much more extensive cooperation with the university to deal with. Whether we collapse the R1 or R2 district into one and a few other changes in this code update is fairly easy for us to work through. This is a little bit more of a complex situation, so I want to pull this one out kind of separately because I know that this is going to take some time and some dialogue with the university to work through. We're also seeing, some disparity between projects depending upon who happens to own the ground that it's being built upon, and we kind of want to get more uniformity, more consistency between projects, and so that's ongoing right now. And we are having a conversation with the university about activities or developments that are privately held that we're permitting that are only ground leasing, and are they subject or not. And parking is one of the complex issues here. And it seems to me this area should be a managed parking system compared to how it is right now.
Do you think that the university and the city can continue and have a civil discourse about how to manage and create this area? It seems to me like we can.
Oh yeah, we've got a great relationship.
So there shouldn't be, in other words, it shouldn't be something that we ask the great body down in Boise to make a rule about. We should just be able to have a dialogue about how to manage it, whether it be parking or other things. Because number one, safety of people is a major issue, and our streets and our water sort of commingle, don't they? I mean, the university has water and the city has water, and I think they mix probably in some line somewhere.
There are some connections with valves if necessary. They're not mixed on a daily basis, but even like the ITC facility on Sweet is connected to university water because that was the service that was there. So that's kind of about the break point, is right through this section. And we do service some privately held properties through here, and the university services some. So it is literally the physically melding of the two institutions is right in here.
Mentally, I keep getting this image of a big tangled pile of wire.
Well, but New York City is managed by one agency, and it's a big tangled body of wire and pipes, rusting and breaking pipes.
One reason I raised the 15-story apartment building is sort of wondering whether, you say this is basically a 40-foot limit?
Right now, the R4 height limit is 40 feet.
I guess I was wondering whether this is an area where some increased density above a 40-foot limit might make sense.
I would probably suggest the 65, which is similar to the CB, similar to what's in the UMC next door. UMC can go higher with the CU. 40 is probably, some of the Greek houses are going to break 40.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess. And so we anticipated having some limit. And I said 40 because what the R4 is right now, we probably expect that in this area we might bump it a little bit because we want to kind of capture the Greek houses and kind of what we have there today. But it'll be somewhere in that ballpark is what I would expect.
Well, we can't, you and I, even I can't exactly remember this, but when Theophilus Tower was built, that must have been an important dialogue between the university and the city to know how to deal with a fire in Theophilus should it happen.
And the university contributed to the purchase of the ladder truck that the
Right.
city currently has because of that project.
All right. So this is actually a kind of a unified code project update in its own
It
right.
is,
It's
it
one
is.
little corner of the code that has its own complexities that you're starting to work through.
It would seem, though, that if you include everything in like Legacy Crossing in a university district kind of thing, that it has economic implications to what might be developed there from a density standpoint. And it might be encouraging if height requirements were bigger, and it might encourage someone to develop there that wouldn't otherwise because of the zoning requirements in the commercial world. So maybe it has, and then from a parking standpoint, if maybe parking could be, since people that live there don't need their car every day, that might be off-site. It might be like the diamond parking at the Spokane airport, where you take the bus to your, would be cheaper than a structure by a lot. Maybe those things are something that needs to be considered.
Okay, number 8, review of potential tandem parking.
As you may recall, we also had an inquiry from the development community about consideration of allowance of tandem parking configuration for multifamily projects. And we talked a little bit at the last meeting about some of the concerns. We do allow tandem parking. That is where one car is parked in front of the other, or you have to, maybe technically if you want to define it, where it requires you to travel through one parking space to reach a second parking space. It's something that the zoning code is silent on. We do and have for some time allowed it in single-family, two-family, but we generally have not allowed it for multifamily. And we talked a little bit at the last meeting about the fact of, we have different parking requirements for multifamily depending upon the number of bedrooms that are in the unit. So if it's a one-bedroom, it's 1.25. If it's a two-bedroom, it's 1.75. And how in a multifamily project, that parking all becomes a pooled resource, that if one person has one car, the people next door have three, it averages out and people can share that, and then there's parking available for individual visitors. When you get into a tandem parking configuration, and specifically looking at where there's a space maybe in a garage bay, which doesn't happen all that often in multifamily, we've been asked to consider it, and maybe a parking stall immediately behind that garage door, then obviously you've got coordination issues. Those probably have to each independently be assigned to a unit so they can coordinate among themselves. But you also have a need for guests and visitors and for that overflow for the household that has 4 cars because it's 4 students living together and those 2 are not going to accommodate it. So there's some risk of coordination of that parking that precludes access to other parking, or, a garage is a great place to store things that may diminish the functionality of a garage parking space if it becomes a storage unit for somebody. So, we've had some concerns about moving into that form of parking in a multifamily setting, but there were some benefits where we could try to reduce the impervious surface because we've got the parking underneath the building, so we're reducing how much hardscape and exterior surface parking there is on a site, so there's some benefits there. It's providing a amenity that somebody in an apartment may not otherwise be able to have, and so there are some benefits to considering allowance of it. We talked last time, and we had a general thought of possibly recognizing this type of configuration in the code, and only maybe recognizing, though, a percentage of the spaces that would be in the garage, like 25%. That way there can be some benefit to allowing it, but then there'd be some excess parking on the site to accommodate the few that end up storing materials in them, or the few that don't become readily available because somebody parks in front of the garage door, they don't have the opener, or the guest that comes that needs a place to park that's not going to block the access to somebody else's parking space. And so we wanted to maybe cautiously approach the topic, look at maybe a fairly conservative recognition, and we talked about 25% of the garage spaces would be counted towards meeting their total off-street parking requirement. So we're giving some credit for it, but we're also saying there's going to have to be some other parking on site. And so that was kind of the general discussion. This is just a quick draft of a potential amendment to the parking area standards that would direct the tandem or stacked parking, where the parking spaces shall be designed such that the vehicle shall not be required to cross another parking space or loading berth to gain access to required parking or loading space, except for parking spaces serving single-family, two-family, twin home, and townhouse dwellings. And I know it's a long list, but those are all, under our definitions, really considered to be single-family dwellings, because the townhouses and twin homes are on individual lots available for sale, even though it may be more than one attached unit. And we have allowed the tandem or stacked for single-family and two-family dwellings. Tandem parking may be allowed for multifamily dwellings under the following conditions. The first of which is that the purpose of it is to provide enclosed garages for the multifamily dwelling resident use. So we don't really want tandem out in the parking lot, 40-foot long parking stalls, because people may know not where to stop. So the intent is we're going to recognize this because there's a benefit. The benefit is it's in a garage, so either that's providing amenity or it's in a garage and it's underneath the building, so we're reducing the impervious area on the site. The second is that the parking space, the tandem parking spaces, the parking space within the garage and in front of the garage, in parentheses, are assigned and furnished for the use of a single dwelling unit without additional compensation. So both of those two stalls are assigned to one unit. And the additional compensation is one thing that we've kind of bumped into a little bit here recently on projects that we're meeting some of their parking requirements by having garages on the site, but then charging an additional amount of money to the residents if they wanted a garage. If nobody's willing to pay, then that effectively takes those parking stalls out of the equation, for meeting their parking demand. And so we want to make sure that it was furnished with the unit with no additional compensation, so that the stalls are available if we're going to be counting them. And then the last is where the tandem space is located. Where a tandem space is located in front of a garage space, the garage space shall be counted as 1/4 of a parking space towards satisfying the number of required off-street parking spaces for the multifamily use. So that's, again, we recognize 25% of those stalls, so that we have some other parking that ends up in a non-tandem configuration that can help with the kind of the pooled resource and the guest and visitor use. So that was the general discussion last time. The Commission asked that we prepare something for you to look at and see what you thought, and so I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and comments.
So this is an interesting piece in that it relates to, one, our reading How is Parking Like a Sandwich for this month, in that if you don't own a vehicle, you're paying to have parking spaces. In the case of the garage here, you're paying to have that in existence. And the other thing that I've been reading, we haven't had it as a reading amongst us, is the decline in car ownership amongst the youth. Speculated for a variety of reasons, economic being one of them. They're maybe strapped with loans or otherwise not able to buy a car or not inclined to buy a car, and there's some debate as to which it is, able or willing. But again, they're being charged a cost for the creation of the builder of this project has real costs in that garage, and therefore has real costs in the rent to pay for the garage for a non-user, potentially.
User could choose to reside someplace else where there isn't a garage if they didn't need it.
True, but they would still be residing somewhere where there's a parking stall built for them.
Correct.
So anyway, it's just an interesting set of... Oh, so another question. So that's sort of one cluster of idea. The other question is, does the current parking requirement, not looking at the tandem piece, but the current parking requirement, does that presume it meets the need for visitors?
Yes.
So on a arterial where we've stripped the parking, therefore the only parking in the neighborhood is on the site, and the residents and the visitors are all co-parking successfully. That is, we have enough parking to meet what we hope is the demand. Now, not on Super Bowl Sunday.
Right. And I don't know that the presumption in many cases in the off-street parking standards is that it is a minimum. We do have many projects that overpark. Multifamily is not usually one of the uses that does that much, because many times when you're looking at multifamily, you're trying to maximize the unit count you can get on the project, and so many of them are at the minimum or within a half dozen spaces of the minimum. As you get into other uses, retailers, for example, will tend to park at 200% of the standard because it's for Black Friday. And so you park it for that because that is an important aspect. But, for the multifamily user, it is to maximize the number of units. For the commercial users, to maximize the customer access and opportunity for those times. So the different folks, different uses tend to react and provide parking in a different way. Whether the minimum now meets all the needs without any overflow is probably not. I mean, I think if you're looking at a multifamily project that just met the minimum, they probably don't meet all of their needs. If you, on A Street or on Baker, you end up with some overflow on-street parking. Now, some of that's because it's proximity to the entryway. Sometimes the on-street parking location is closer to the unit door, and so it's more convenient. And most of those lots generally have some spaces available within them to be able to accommodate the visitors. So I think overall, for the most part, they probably do meet the majority of the needs, but I can't really say that, definitively for all cases.
We don't want to design the parking for Super Bowl Sunday either.
Yes.
That's the same Black Friday scenario, but in a different part of town.
I mean, we tend to be more parking intense than, a non-university community would be in multifamily housing, just because you have 3 students living together and they may have 3 cars or 4 students or 5 students, and so we tend to be a little bit more parking heavy in multifamily than if you had more single individuals or married couples or small families, maybe parking's there. So we tend to be a little bit heavier on the parking use just based on the demographics of the community. But I think overall the standards have really been reasonably meeting the need. We haven't seen significant issues.
Yeah, I was going to say that, as with many things, it's sort of complaint-driven. We had some complaints. We spent some time looking at parking requirements and changed them a bit. We haven't had much complaints, so it's probably more or less meeting needs.
The only complaint we've had recently was when the garages were being leased separately, and that was taking them out of the supply. Yeah, that's where we've had the issues.
And if the article is portent for the future and people start having less cars, we'll, at some time, a decade from now, we can probably reduce the requirement.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm having trouble putting together the first sentence into something meaningful in my brain here. Is it trying to say, so the first part, you're trying to avoid the big long line of official parking spots, is that true? Where that you have to drive through the parking spot to reach your number 8?
The first line is really defining what a tandem means. It means you have to travel through one space to reach a second space.
Right. Okay.
So there's not a travel aisle that you can go through to gain access to that space.
Yeah.
So it is really saying parking spaces shall be designed such that you don't have to go through another space to reach them, is really the intent, with the exception of these uses, except for parking spaces serving these other uses.
Yeah. No, that was the problem. I missed the period there at tandem or stacked parking, and was reading it all as one sentence.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. No, that was a little bit of a heading there.
Yeah.
And then rather than trying to lump that all in one sentence and go into multifamily, kind of include it as a separate sentence.
Yeah, so it's just saying that the tandem parking is legal for single-family, two-family, twin home, or townhouse dwellings.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't recall from our last discussion what the purpose is of not allowing additional compensation. How does that dynamic work?
Because if you have, like the case we have here, I mean, if it's part of the rent and you increase the rent because that's something comes with it and it's just furnished with the unit, then that's perfectly fine. But if you can rent this apartment, but you have to pay extra for the garage, if people aren't willing to pay for the garages, then that essentially takes them out of the parking inventory that would be available for their use. So now all of a sudden we're not meeting the parking requirements for the project.
They're just not used at all if somebody has to pay.
That's the concern we have. That's the experience we're having right now. Is that if you have to pay $160 a month extra for your garage, on top of the $650 or $7 you're paying, and they don't want to pay that, and the market can't bear that, then essentially those spaces are effectively not available to meet the off-street parking requirement, and so that creates an economic hurdle to compliance with the zoning code. So what we want to do is, if we're getting into that needs to be furnished with units so that you are providing, that parking is being provided to meet the need. At least that's our intent. That's the whole intent of it, is we're getting a bunch of complaints on a project where this is occurring. And because now everybody's parking out on the street because there are no parking spaces available because nobody wants to pay that additional amount to rent the garages.
Go ahead.
Now, if the garages were above and beyond the off-street parking requirement, then we wouldn't care. If they had the parking requirement in the parking lot, and then you could, in addition, if you wanted to rent this garage because you had storage or you wanted to use it to park your car in it, then we wouldn't care because it's not impeding them meeting their off-street parking requirement.
I'd suggest instead of the word additional compensation there, put separate compensation.
Separate.
I think that makes
Sure.
it more clear that you can bump the rent if it comes with it, but you're not leasing it separately.
And that would be the intent, yeah.
Is there another hand up?
Are there some of those units, housing units out on A Street, have garages? And the garages, I presume, were part of the parking. We have all this parking space and all these garages, except that many of the garages are rented by somebody who doesn't live in that unit.
And that shouldn't be the case because that would then be mini storage, which
Exactly.
self-storage, and that's what we're having with this other.
Isn't that a part of
I don't have knowledge of that happening out there. The one that we're currently dealing with, that is what's happening. It is being advertised for people to rent that don't live on the property. It was we'll give them the first right, but if they don't want to rent the garages, then we're going to list it as storage space for rent for somebody who doesn't live on the property. That's actually a different land use. We would call that a self-storage use. It's a commercial activity and it's not allowed in that district. I'm not aware of that on A Street. It could be happening, but I'm not aware of that.
I have to go home.
I know of really two projects. One's fairly old. On A, where there was a central row of garages, and it was before my time, so I have not looked at that project to know whether those were considered as part of the off-street parking requirement or not. The other ones we have would be the Black Cove down on Baker a little ways, and those are condos, and those were with the units. But I don't have any first-hand knowledge of that. I do know that is the experience we're having here, where they're renting it to people who don't live on property for storage, and that obviously is taking the parking out of the supply. So, and that was kind of what was driving that compensation item.
Though, if
You used to rent one of those.
if I have one vehicle and I have a tandem operation, and I simply decide to use my garage for storage or a shop or whatever.
So long as it's for that tenant's decision about how they use the space. If it's available to them and they need parking, then they'll make it available. If they don't, then they can park the bikes and
Whatever in there.
Yeah.
But now effectively there are 2-car household. They're taking, their car needs another spot because it can't use that spot. So they've bumped up their demand for stalls by that one that just disappeared.
Which is why we're only recognizing 25 of the garage
25%.
spaces, so we get some extra out there too. Because I know that will occur. We all know that will occur, to some degree.
I've heard rumors that there are actually people who park their cars in the garage rather than all their stuff in there.
So we all know that's going to occur, and that's why we're looking at this maybe conservative entry approach at recognizing only a quarter of those spaces as meeting towards the minimum requirement, and then let's see how it works. If we can increase that, I'd like to, but I'm a little suspicious.
So what is your pleasure, folks? Do you want to move forward with this? Do you want to spend a little bit more time thinking about this before we have a public hearing on it?
I think it probably is ready to move forward.
Yeah, I would go with that. That looks pretty good to me.
I agree. I think it might be useful to have a little bit of work on simplifying some of the language, which we're having difficulty interpreting. But other than that, I think it's ready to go forward.
I think with Greg's.
Yeah, we could put without separate additional compensation.
Additional or separate, or
I say separate
or just
additional
separate is what
compensation.
yeah.
Maybe that first sentence could be reworked. That is a doozy.
Yeah.
It is. It is.
But the concept is
trying
there.
to describe what a tandem stall is.
Does a sketch work?
A sketch will work. I just don't have a place to put a sketch in this location in the code. And I will say this is the language largely from Coeur d'Alene. So the kind of defining what the tandem was is.
What's funny, I guess, is that the heading says tandem or stacked parking. The sentence defines non-tandem or stacked parking. It defines parking spaces.
Shall be designed such that they don't
Required. So that they're the opposite of tandem or stacked.
with an exception. And that's kind of somewhat, we don't do this in our code very often. We don't state the negative and then state the exception. The building codes are entirely structured that way, where you can't do this except in these situations. Our code doesn't take that tense and very often. It is what Coeur d'Alene's was, which was a prohibition against this, with except in this situation. And it seemed to fit what we were trying to accomplish, but it is not the clearest wording, but it does state, I mean, I actually think it's probably maybe the best language to describe what it is that you're saying you can't do. Drive through one stall to gain access to another. It's really what it is.
So I get the sense that you are happy to proceed to public hearing with this. And might that be the same?
Yeah, we can do the same time frame in April.
Okay.
It is, yet, are you going to try to clean up that first sentence? Or
I'm open to suggestions. I'm happy with the way it reads.
Unless you come up with
I mean,
a
if you have a suggestion, parking spaces shall be designed such that a vehicle shall not be required to cross another parking space or loading berth to gain access to a required parking or loading space, except for spaces serving.
Yeah, maybe.
I could probably get rid of the loading berth language, because we really don't need that. Cross another parking space to gain access to required parking or loading. We could probably get rid of required parking space, except for parking spaces, except those, or maybe except those serving single family. We could probably trim out a few words.
I mean, kind of what it seems to me it might help is since the first part of the definition is regular parking spaces, or the first part of the sentence is regular parking spaces. You can't drive through another space to a parking space. And then the second part totally is, except that tandem parking spaces are allowed in these areas. So maybe if you could figure out some way to make a clearer
It's as if you need two definitions.
Yeah,
The parking
right.
space is a definition, and the tandem parking space is a definition.
Yeah.
And then, now that you've got them defined, you say these are allowed in these cases and these
Right.
are not allowed in these cases.
And that is one option. I mean, we could go in, a parking space is defined in the code. Tandem is not. So one option would be, you could go and define tandem in the definition section of the code about what a tandem space is. It is a parking space that requires you to travel through another space. Space is arranged in such a manner that requires you to travel through one space to gain the other. Without direct access from a travel aisle or other vehicle maneuvering area.
Yeah.
And then you could just come in and say tandem parking spaces are not allowed except under these circumstances, and you could include it.
Yeah.
The reason why we try to avoid doing that is when you go into the definitions, then you have to renumber everything, and you end up with a 20-page ordinance.
Yeah.
And so if you can describe what it is here,
Yeah.
and not have to go into our 120 numbered list of definitions and insert one and renumber all the remaining, Patty, the legal secretary, prefers that.
Yeah.
Is there some reason you can't include the definition here and just pretend?
Well, that was kind of the intent of the description, is that we are defining it here, which is, and we can, but we generally don't just insert a definition independently within the text of the code here.
Yeah.
So it
Defined if you do that.
right, and so here we're just trying to describe that a space you can't travel to another except in these situations.
Yeah.
And so it is it is something that we could certainly clean up when we go through and restructure all the definitions. We could insert a tandem there.
Yeah.
And then maybe modify this at that time. This is a way to not have to get into the definitions and aggravate Patty, because every time we insert a definition,
Is there a way that you could make the accept and everything that follows as a separate little, like the way item I or 1 and 2 are, just some way of really...
That's initially where I was heading. The
Yeah.
problem is I was going to have a list that little I-1 was a single-family, two-family twin house, and then the next was the multifamily. We don't go another tier in the code in the outline than lowercase Roman numerals here for the multifamily to list the conditions under which. I had it in a sentence with semicolons separating the conditions.
In other words, he's thought about this.
There's a reason why it ended up the way it did.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I spent 30 minutes on it at about 4 o'clock today. So, I mean, it hasn't had a ton of time, but I did run into these bumps. I did try.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a method to the madness. Not to say that it's perfect, but there is a bit of a reason why it ended up in the way that it did. Yeah. If we, I think we can certainly take out the loading berth or spaces, because I don't think it's really relevant. We can keep it at parking spaces shall be designed such that the vehicle shall not be required to cross another parking space to gain access to required parking space, except for those serving single-family, two-family, twin home, and townhouse dwellings. We've got a lot of parking spaces there. But the required is kind of important to note, because we're saying that second one you're getting to, you have to have. If you didn't have to have it, then it's okay. We wouldn't care.
Right. If it was
So it's important to make the distinction there. And so you can't cross one to gain access to another when that other is required, except for these situations. I can certainly take a look and see if I can improve that language, or at least eliminate the loading berth language, and clean it up just a little bit.
Yeah, it sounds like, sadly enough, the only real way around it would be to define the tandem parking.
Would be the preferred way of doing it.
Yeah.
But then sometimes it's nice to have everything in one section, and I have to go hunt for definitions.
Yeah.
Even though most people probably know what tandem means, but not everybody.
Yeah, I had no idea to start with.
And so sending somebody to go hunt for it in the definitions, if you can describe it here conveniently, then
So, we'll look for it to come back in a month in the public hearing.
And I'll share the revised language next week, just briefly, so everybody can take a look at it.
But we could replace the whole code with, we'll let you know if you do something wrong.
People don't like that.
It's called maximum flexibility and maximum uncertainty.
Yes.
So, anything else for the good of the order? We are adjourned.